The leaders are fleeing for their lives. The innocents bear the brunt of the chaos. Flames consume the streets of Daban Kowa, smoke choking the air as calamity engulfs the town, all birthed from the leaders' insatiable greed. Will peace ever find its way back to this shattered land?
Like and subscribe.
Once upon a time, in the arid town of Daban Kowa, nestled in the northern part of Nigeria, lived a king whose name sent shivers down the spines of the townsfolk. King Idris was no ordinary monarch. He was fierce, unyielding, and consumed by greed. His gaze alone was enough to silence dissent. Under his rule, every government allocation meant for the betterment of the people was siphoned off into his personal coffers. Whatever scraps he chose to distribute among the townsfolk were merely enough to keep them alive, not enough to help them thrive. The king's cabinet members were no better. Each of them was wealthy beyond measure, basking in the luxury afforded by their illicitly acquired riches. Together, they shared the allocations meant for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure, leaving the common people to wallow in abject poverty. Daban Kowa was a shadow of what it could have been, a place filled with potential but stifled by neglect. The town's only school, once a symbol of hope for future generations, now stood in ruins. With no desks or chairs, children sat on the bare ground, their books resting on their knees as they scribbled notes. Its walls were broken and crumbling, the missing roofs exposing students to the elements. During the rainy season, lessons were often disrupted as water poured in, leaving children huddled together for shelter. In the dry season, the harsh sun baked the classrooms, making it nearly impossible to concentrate. Water, the essence of life, was a precious resource in Daban Kowa. The town had no functional wells, forcing its residents to trek for miles to fetch water from distant streams. Women balanced heavy pots on their heads, their faces etched with exhaustion, while young children tagged along, carrying smaller containers. The roads reflected the town's decline. Except for the pristine road leading to the king's palace, every other path was a nightmare to navigate. They were riddled with potholes and coated in dust, turning into muddy traps during the rains. The town's potential lay buried under years of decay and indifference. The local hospital, once a beacon of hope and the pride of the town, had deteriorated into a shadow of its former self. It had become a place where the sick went not for healing but to meet their end. The walls, once painted a bright, cheerful white, were now cracked and stained, a reflection of the despair within. Medicines that were once stocked in abundance had become a distant memory, leaving shelves barren and patients without remedies. The few doctors and nurses who remained did so not out of dedication but because they had nowhere else to go. They were unpaid, overworked, and utterly unmotivated, their initial passion replaced by a sense of futility. For the townsfolk, seeking medical help was a luxury they could neither afford nor count on. When illness struck, desperation took over. Families turned to prayers, herbal remedies, or the wisdom of elders, clinging to anything that might bring relief. Stories of miraculous recoveries were whispered like folktales, offering slivers of hope to a community drowning in despair. Yet, the grim reality remained. The hospital, once a sanctuary of healing, now stood as a grim reminder of neglect and the fragility of human life. Gambo, a young man in his late 20s, had borne the brunt of Daban Kowa's endless hardships. Growing up in the town meant enduring a life of deprivation, where even the basics of survival felt like luxuries. Yet, among all the struggles, it was the death of his mother that broke him. She had been his anchor, the one person who kept him going despite the odds. When she fell gravely ill, Gambo knew the local hospital was her only hope. With her frail body leaning heavily on his shoulders, he carried her there, desperate for help. But his pleas were met with a cold reality. The hospital lacked the medicine needed to save her life. The few nurses on duty could do little but refer her to a better-equipped hospital in the distant city. Gambo's heart sank. He had no money for transportation, let alone the cost of treatment in a facility far beyond his means. Every door he knocked on for help remained shut, as his neighbors were as helpless as he was. He stayed by her side, holding her hand as her condition worsened. The light in her eyes, once vibrant with love and warmth, faded slowly. Her final words, whispered with a weak smile, were a plea for him to remain strong. As she took her last breath, Gambo felt the weight of his failure, not just as a son but as a product of a broken system that had robbed him of the chance to save her. As Gambo dug his mother's grave with his bare hands, the weight of his grief felt unbearable. The sun blazed overhead, scorching his back as tears streamed down his face, mixing with the dirt beneath him. Each thrust of his hands into the hard earth felt like a release of his anger and despair. The memory of his mother's final moments haunted him, the helplessness, the injustice, the pain of losing her to a system that had long abandoned its people. Something inside him snapped as he dug deeper, his hands raw and bleeding. He paused, clenched his fists, and through gritted teeth, whispered a vow, "By Allah, I will avenge my mother's death. I will fight for this town, for the people who have suffered like me." In that moment, Gambo's grief transformed into resolve. He was no longer just a mourner but a man determined to bring change. Under the shade of an old baobab tree, Gambo gathered the youth of Daban Kowa. They were men like him, hungry, tired, and desperate for change. His voice trembled with rage as he spoke. "For years, we have lived like slaves in our own land. The king and his allies feast while we starve. They live in mansions while our homes crumble. My mother's death is just one of the many tragedies we have endured. How long will we remain silent? Today, we rise. Today, we take back what is ours." The young men roared in agreement, their anger turning into a movement for freedom. They called themselves the Sons of Daban Kowa. The group marched resolutely toward the palace, their chants rising like a storm, echoing through the dusty streets of Daban Kowa. "Justice for the people! Justice for the forgotten!" they cried. News of the protest spread rapidly, and as they advanced, townsfolk abandoned their daily routines to join them. By the time they reached the imposing gates of the palace, the crowd had swelled to hundreds, a sea of angry but determined faces. There, they were met by a line of armed guards, the king's loyal protectors, their rifles gleaming ominously in the harsh sun. One of the guards stepped forward, his voice stern. "Disperse now, or we will open fire." The threat hung heavy in the air, silencing the chants momentarily. Tension crackled like a live wire as both sides stood their ground. But Gambo, undaunted, stepped forward, his voice ringing with conviction. "We have no weapons, but we have our voices, our strength, and our determination. You can kill us, but you cannot silence the truth. We march not for war but for justice." The guards hesitated, their fingers twitching on the triggers. They glanced at each other, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. They had heard the same cries of despair from their families and friends. Suddenly, amidst the confusion, a scuffle broke out. Fueled by desperation and courage, the protesters surged forward, overpowering the guards. Rifles were snatched away, but instead of firing, the protesters held them high, symbols of a people reclaiming their dignity. Armed and emboldened, the Sons of Daban Kowa transformed their peaceful protest into a fiery rebellion. Fueled by years of pent-up anger and injustice, they moved with purpose, storming the homes of the wealthy elite who had exploited them for generations. Mansions that once stood as symbols of privilege and greed were set ablaze, their grand facades crumbling in the flames. The streets filled with cries of defiance as the rebels looted hoarded riches, money, food, and supplies that had been denied to the suffering people of Daban Kowa. The chaos spread like wildfire. Gunshots echoed through the night as the rebels clashed with the king's remaining forces, who fought desperately to maintain control. Streets became battlefields, and the air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning wood and metal. The palace, a towering emblem of King Idris's authority, became the final target of their fury. With torches in hand, the rebels stormed its gates, setting the once majestic structure ablaze. The flames consumed the walls, lighting up the night sky like a beacon of revolution. Under the cover of darkness, King Idris and his cabinet members fled, their wealth and power rendered meaningless in the face of the uprising. Their escape marked the end of an era, but it left Daban Kowa in turmoil. The uprising continued for days, until the town was unrecognizable. It was only when the government intervened, sending soldiers to restore order, that the violence ceased. Amid the chaos, innocent lives bore the brunt of the unfolding rebellion. Families cowered in their crumbling homes, their whispers of prayers swallowed by the roar of gunfire and the crackle of flames. Mothers clutched their children tightly, shielding them from the horrors outside as thick black smoke filled the air. The once lively streets of Daban Kowa were now a battlefield, strewn with debris and echoing with cries of anguish. Gambo stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving as he surveyed the destruction. His heart ached for the innocent lives caught in the crossfire, the shopkeepers whose livelihoods were reduced to ash, the children whose laughter had been replaced by tears. Yet, He reminded himself of the price of revolution. Freedom, he thought, was never won without sacrifice. As he rallied his fellow rebels to protect the vulnerable, he vowed that the fight would not be in vain, that a new Daban Kowa would rise from the ashes. Government officials met with Gambo and the leaders of the rebellion. The protesters aired their grievances, detailing years of neglect and suffering under King Idris's rule. The government, recognizing the legitimacy of their demands, agreed to provide immediate relief. Within weeks, changes began to take shape. Schools were rebuilt, roads were repaired, and the hospital was restocked with medicines. The government ensured that future allocations would go directly to community projects, bypassing corrupt officials. King Idris was stripped of his title, and a new leader, chosen by the people, was crowned. The town of Daban Kowa began to heal, its people hopeful for the first time in decades. As life returned to normal, Gambo stood under the baobab tree, addressing the townsfolk. "This victory is not mine, it is ours. But let us never forget the price we paid. Let this be a lesson to all leaders. Greed and corruption will always be overthrown by the will of the people." The crowd erupted in applause, their faces shining with hope and determination. Greed and corruption in leadership can destroy communities, but the power of unity and the will of the people can bring about change. This story is a reminder to leaders to govern with justice and fairness, and to the people to never accept oppression in silence. Disclaimer: this story is not intended to instigate problems or support chaos. Instead, it seeks to highlight the devastating effects of greed and corruption in leadership and to provoke thoughtful reflection on the consequences of poor governance. The narrative is not aimed at any particular tribe, community, or group but serves as a universal message relevant to all. Thank you for watching. Tell us your opinion in the comments section. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel Chukwudi Alalar Studio at Chukwudi Alalar.
Like and subscribe.